Hey everyone, welcome to another AMA hosted by T, where we invite key open source people to come up and have an AMA with Max Howell, who is the CEO of PackageX, which is also the key contributor of T Protocol. Today we're joined with Jason Coombs, who's the maintainer of several influential open source projects. So Jason, welcome. Max, welcome. We appreciate having both of you guys here. Looking forward to another great AMA. Max, do you want to start with an intro?
Thanks, Ben. So, I'm Max Howell, been in open source probably 20 plus years at this point, kind of a serial open sourcerer, and I've created a few influential projects for sure, like the one that everyone knows is Homebrew, which I created back in 2009, had its 15th birthday on Monday, Tuesday, depending on your time zone. Turns out I committed the first commit at 4 minutes past midnight, so it makes it pretty difficult. But yeah, my journey in my career was always like I wanted to work on open source. That's all I really got the most value out of. Like, I've had some fun with some startups here and there. But as open source became more and more important to how we build software and how the internet runs over the last 15, 20 years, especially, the value that was created at the top never really trickled down to open source. So those of us who maintained it didn't have a choice. We had to maintain it in our free time or take time off from work in order to do it, and yet it's essential nowadays. So that led me to founding T Protocol about 2.5 years ago, and super happy with what we built. The idea is to make it possible for open source maintainers like Jason and hopefully myself again one day to work on open sources as our jobs.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that. Jason, welcome. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Do you mind giving, before we dive into questions for you, do you mind giving a quick little intro?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm also a big proponent of open source. I've been involved with it for maybe the same amount of time. I remember getting involved with Python in the late 90s, but contributing to things like PyWin32 in the early 2000s. Eventually found myself contributing to CPython and others, and then eventually made Python my expertise, my specialty, and spent time building that expertise and built my career around that. And so that's where, so it's been kind of a part of my life, and I try to build it into the work that I do. But I also find that the projects that I'm interested in, the things that I'm working on, aren't necessarily aligned with my work, and so I spend spare time and other, or when I'm unemployed, a free agent like I am now, working on open source, for fun. And so I remember in the late 2000s having a similar vision as Max. Could we create a world where value is attributed to the people who create that value, and shared, kind of trickling through the economy and made proportional to the people who are contributing it. So I'm excited about what T is trying to do.
That's great. Thank you. I love, I'm kind of excited to listen to Jason, to you and Max talk with all of your guys' experience in open source. As myself, that's newish to it. It's gonna be a great episode. So I'm super pumped. So, you mentioned you've been in it for 20 plus years. What was it that initially got you attracted to open source, and what kind of made you dive in?
So I was at university and was following that academic culture of openness and exploration and inquisitiveness. And I realized, I could go to forums, I could go to news groups or whatever, and post questions and get involved with the motivations behind a particular decision. In fact, I remember one of my first contributions, if you will, was a complaint to the Python system. I went into Python and said, okay, what happens if I recurse into a function indefinitely? I want to crash my computer. I want to do that in Python. And after 10,000 iterations, it instead threw an exception and said, no, you can't do that. You've recursed too deep. And I thought, oh, that seems like a bug, right? This seems like an artificial limitation that doesn't exist. And I filed news group post about it, and somebody said, well, what is the deal there? Why is this a problem for you? And I said, well, it's an academic issue. I think in principle it should be different, but in retrospect, that was actually wise. Probably have some guardrails and protect a bad program from accidentally consuming all the RAM, overflowing the stack, etc. So that was my first kind of engagement with the community, but it was really great to see how the community could collaborate and build and enhance our knowledge together, and build knowledge through these systems, through the software and whatnot. So that kept me engaged even while I was writing commercial stuff for my employers. I wanted to see these things grow. So I was using PyWin32, as I mentioned before. I got a chance to implement the time zone functionality. So Python didn't have time zone functionality back then. It had a time zone protocol that you could follow, but no implementations, no concrete implementations. At the same time, Windows had this database of time zones that it maintained over time. And I thought, well, this is the perfect marriage of two things. So I sought to implement the protocol using the Windows time zones in the registry and contributed that back to PyWin32, and the maintainer accepted it. And so I felt rewarded for bringing that to the world, that I was able to actually contribute something that other people could use. And it came with bug reports, it came with maintenance burden, and that was something that was kind of new to me, is thinking about how does that how do I engage with that, and what does that how mean to me? When am I responsible for this? How responsible am I for it? Unfortunately, I was kind of a sub-maintainer of this larger project, so I got some mentorship, I got some support in learning how that works. But it became kind of my modus operandi. If something's not working, I can find this. I can see if other people have tried to create the solution. If no one's created it, I can create it myself, and very often contribute that back.
It's incredible.
It's a typical way things go, really, isn't it? Like finding that little niche that appeals to you, and then discovering that open source isn't just about making the bits that are fun to you. That there's expectations that come with it. You're part of a community, and you love being a part of that community. That's what drags us all in the first place. And I think it's true that most of the open source maintainers that maintain all this, like all the 11 odd million packages that power so much of the world, it's very typical as well. I thought that Python didn't have time zone functionality initially. Like that's how we build things, right? It's like, I'll do the bits that I need, you have to do the bits you need. But yeah, the way that the value just hasn't propagated after all this time, while these companies come along and go, oh, this is all free software that we can use, right? Free. And yeah, somehow we keep that motivation going to some extent. I have several projects where I just don't maintain them as well as I should be maintaining them. Is the truth of things. They deserve more of my attention, but like, how can I find the time for that without making personal sacrifices? So it's the dilemma.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely is. Jason, if you don't mind, can we hear a little bit about like the inspiration that you got to create some of your more popular libraries that you have, like keyring and inflect and things of those?
Yeah. So keyring was a Google Summer of Code project, and it was proposed by Tarek Ziadi, who I was working with on the setup tools and distribute projects. And he was entirely responsible for creating the Summer of Code and finding the student to work on it. Kang, I believe is his name. And so it was written entirely by a student as part of a Summer of Code project. And then subsequently, there was no one left to maintain it. And I was using this, I needed this functionality, wanted to make it I wanted to avoid having to type passwords everywhere I go. I'd like to store them securely somewhere, and that's what keyring does for the Python ecosystem. So when you upload a package to PyPI, or when you log into your favorite website, as long as you have those passwords stored in your Windows Credential Vault or your Mac OS keychain, or in one of the, maybe I think it's called dbus security. I forget exact security service. I think on Linux. You don't have to know about any of that, except it will store it securely and bring it back for you. And so you don't have to type those passwords. You don't have to add them to your scripts. You can keep them out of your source code, which is a good security policy. So I adopted that project in order to continue to maintain it, and so I got chances to evolve it to replace sub-processes with native C APIs where that made sense, so that it could be pure Python and more, get better interfaces. Similarly, the inflect project was something that I adopted. I was using it in my projects. It seemed to be having a lot of value, and I certainly wanted a way to not have to repeat myself in terms of making a number plural or not, depending on a particular number. So when you're writing a user interface, you have one thing or two things. Of course, you could just write that every single time, you write the logic for that particular subject, or the inflect project generalizes that and makes it generally available. So again, it's building that knowledge and capability and making it reusable for others. The path project is actually one that I had written my own thing. I called it user path, and I remember working with some colleagues and suggesting that we use this. And when they said, why should we have a path object instead of simply using all of the OS path functions? And I explained that there's some value in having it be a rich object you can pass around, that the object-oriented model of path manipulation is useful in terms of simplifying code, kind of elevating some of the interfaces. And so I'd written my own. There was this one called path.py that was out there. And so I ended up, I recognized that maybe theirs was a little more mature. It was also more popular. So I decided to contribute, to essentially shed my implementation and adopt theirs and contribute back to that instead. And again, I found myself a maintainer of that. So I didn't initiate any of these projects, but found myself maintaining them and making them better, addressing other users' issues. And so, yeah, I'm really pleased that Path was out there. And then, of course, now there's something in the standard library that does something very similar, but there are still a handful of reasons why this third-party implementation is more valuable, has better features in it. I find myself still using it, even though there's a standard feature in the library. And so I've documented those so that they're prominent for people to see and can decide effectively which route they want to go for a particular application.
Yeah, I've written my own pathing library for pretty much every language that I've ever consumed, because I think things like that, like there's certain ways you code where one of the main reasons I keep writing my own is I know what kind of bugs I produce. And so I encode into the library ways for me to generally avoid those bugs and then document it nicely. And I know that there's a subset of other programmers out there that are like me in how they approach pathing. So they've become relatively popular on all the platforms that I've written them for. And it's always fun. Like, one of the first things I do when I start a new language is like, okay, let's port my pathing library. So it's kind of an intro as well to like new languages, because you always have to manipulate paths.
For sure.
Jason, let's just, if you don't mind, let's talk how you've received funding in the past, if any. I always will reference this on these calls, and Max is going to eventually get tired of hearing this, but I know he always references on some of his stuff that he would maybe get enough funding in a month time to buy a cup of coffee when he was working on open source. So, if you could, before we kind of dive into T and things you like about it or things you've seen and stuff of that, can we just get a brief overview on any funding you've received, how it's gone, like your general thoughts on that?
Yeah, you bet. So most of this has been a labor of love, especially up until 2019. But or maybe it was 2018. Sometime in that time frame, I bumped into Donald Fisher, the founder of Tidelift, and they were spinning up Tidelift, which is also trying to pay the maintainers to find a way to make maintaining open source viable. And so I got in early on that, and that was with the Setup Tools project primarily, but it's now funding about 12 of the projects that I maintain. So there is some overlap. I think Keyring, Inflect, and Path are all in that that pool. And so I make not a living, but maybe a reasonable, maybe enough to pay rent, in a mid-sized city. So that's kind of nice. That's something that gives me comfort in thinking about maybe retiring early and having some supplemental income, but actually getting rewarded for that work and it's been interesting. I've been able to share that with other maintainers and bring them in and connect them on that. So yeah, there have been a few other cases where people have thanked me with like a cup of coffee or something along those lines. I think I have some GitHub sponsorships that are tiny, maybe not even a cup of coffee a month. So that's an interesting prospect, but I haven't seen a lot happen from that. On the reverse side, though, I do offer bounties on projects that I maintain to incentivize things that I guess it seems like the community isn't necessarily incentivized to solve a problem that I'd like to see solved, or I don't have the time to do it myself, but to build the expertise and to solve a particular problem. So I'll put a bounty, I'll post it in GitHub, and just donate that money however they would like to see it afterwards. I've tried some of the bounty services like Bounty Source, but I've found that didn't so I never spent time hunting bounties, trying to earn those bounties. And when I tried to offer them, I found it difficult to even find people willing to take them, and it kind of constrained that issue in a way that I didn't feel comfortable posting bounties freely because I was unsure about what it would take to actually solve things. You got to be careful about the contract or whatever the bounty solution should be. So I've been a little bit cautious around bounties.
Yeah. Like in general, I've just when I was thinking about creating T, I found that the solutions that existed really only could figure out how to fund open source via charity. And at the end of the day, like, we all want to be charitable people, but it just doesn't really happen. And certainly expecting companies that benefit from open source to treat it like a charity, it just isn't working. If you look at the companies that do donations, the amount they offer is it just doesn't spread far enough. And I love that Tidelift were trying to convert that way of thinking towards, hey, you're securing your platform, but still getting the corporates involved, it's difficult. And so, I love that with T, we're changing that. We're not trying to involve companies per se. Like, I talk to a lot of people, and they're like, how are companies going to participate? And I'm like, well, they can. This is a value ecosystem where they can participate in the economics of open source, but we don't need them to. We've got 1.5 million people signed up on our testnet. only a third of those have a GitHub account. The other 2/3 are just people who believe in participating in the economics of open source. They're not necessarily companies. I doubt many of them are. Mostly they're just people that see this as a way to participate and reward open source and gain rewards themselves. So yeah, I love that we're trying to do something new. That's why it's going to work.
Yeah, and that's a good, thanks for the alley-oop there, Max, because that's a good transition to, Jason, the next question for you. So what was it about T protocol that maybe sparked some interest in you, that made you think, you know, oh, this could have legs. Let me try the test net and upload some packages and things of that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about T that's particularly exciting is how it's less managed, that it is inherently a distributed kind of system, that it's not designed to be, it's less about being the broker as creating the protocol that allows people to interface and to reward each other, to get involved financially, monetarily with these products, with the open source ecosystem. And in particular, making it easy for open source maintainers to get set up with it. Right? I was impressed to see how easy it was to kind of enroll, get started, to securely authorize a project to be in the system with a simple commit, and making that fairly intuitive, but also providing the app that makes it easy easy to follow. So. But the most important thing is just this concept of channeling the value through the system, and building a system that manages that rather than having an organization responsible for it.
Yeah, I think it's a key part of what we're doing is that the protocol is being launched by a non-profit entity that isn't the company that received VC funding. So as it goes forwards, it's not beholden to any of the people who have invested in it. It is beholden to itself to ensure that the protocol rewards open source and is governed and run by open source. And the fact that we recognize the value of projects individually, and just we've created this whole complex system of tokenomics in order to make that sustainable going forwards without it needing to rely on typical ways that money moves around, right? Like capitalism is functional, but it just doesn't apply to open source. It was never going to work by trying. That's why everyone tries to make a charity, right? They're like, well, you can't pay for open source because that changes the very nature of it. But I guess we can just say all open source maintainers must beg. That kind of works. So yeah, it was necessary to do it with crypto. I didn't realize that fully before starting the project. I just saw that it was a new way that might change things. But as we built it, we're seeing how it really has a great chance.
Perfect. Jason, so last question from me, and then the floor is yours. So what do you think of T protocol so far? Have you used the app? What have you done? What do you like? What don't you like? Any suggestions for the team on things and ways we could tweak it to make it a little better?
Yeah, so the T app is really polished. It's clear that a lot of work has gone into making it work, making it functional. I know we're still in the test period, the beta period, so there's bound to be issues, and the team's been really responsive around such issues, and that's great. It's neat to see there's lots of coming soon, and a vision for where it's going. So that's also great, so that there's no surprises. Actually, that there's a lot of context that the app provides, and you can almost learn how this system works just by registering, getting involved, starting to use it, and that's a good sign. That's a really strong sign. I still feel like I don't have a deep understanding of how how all of the pieces work, how the crypto is involved. But I think that's also okay, right? I think part of the goal of this is to make it so that you don't have to, that an open source maintainer doesn't have to know these things, that they can mostly focus on their value proposition, making their product more valuable, more secure, and they can stop at that. I am, I guess, a proponent of good crypto and taking advantage of that. So I'm interested in learning more, but from a first blush, this is exactly the right approach I'd like to see in an application, for maintainers to register their projects and manage their projects within T.
Yeah, it was good to hear. Like, it was very much a priority for us to make it very simple for open source maintainers, because we just want you to keep making open source. We don't want to make it so that you have to think about all these other parts of the tokenomics and how the crypto functions. And that's how it should work once we got to mainnet. You're just receiving your T token rewards on a 24-hour basis and not worrying about anything else. So we don't want to change the nature of open source. Like, open source is beautiful, and I would personally be devastated if anything about how it works is changed in the slightest. So it was a very conscientious effort to make it simple and non-intrusive. And I think it's one of those things where once you start receiving the rewards, you're going to want to dig deeper. That's often how it works for me. It's like, oh, well, this is great. Okay, let's figure out more about how it works, and that'll probably open the world up to like other ideas about what can be done with the token. Quite honestly, like, I expect the open source community to like dive in and start writing all sorts of smart contracts to make the most out of the value that is being created.
Well, Jason, I know I speak for everyone from the team when we say thank you for testing it out. Thank you for the words you gave us on that. With that, Max, do you have any additional questions for Jason before I hop off stage here and the stage is his?
No, I don't. Thank you for answering those. That was very interesting.
All right, Jason, I will hop off here and come back on before we sign off. But other than that, Max is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thanks, Ben. So, yeah, jumping into, I guess, my questions, and I think I've alluded to some of it already, but I'm really admiring where, how T is trying to build this, contribution chain and conveying value through it. And I'm just, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on how T is doing this, beyond what other institutions are doing with the bounties and the GitHub sponsors and Tidelift.
Yeah, I think we're fundamentally different in that we have pre-calculated the impact of all the open source projects that exist by using package manager data to create T-rank. T-rank being something between 0 and 100, where 100 is impossible to obtain because that would mean there was only one open source project in the world. And, it's exponential. So the more and more impactful you are, the higher rank. And then we distribute rewards based on that. So it really just genuinely rewards how important your project has become so that you can, be rewarded based on like how impactful it is to the entire open source ecosystem. So, that kind of creates just a system by itself, where it's not charity, it's recognition. And like, part of why we do open source for sure is like, yeah, that validation of making something that's important. And so we're just like making that more tangible. But the fundamental difference for sure is like charity versus the value of open source representing that. We're going to have bounties coming soon, which allow people to report security issues on open source. And what I'm hoping happens with that is that it becomes a genuinely great system for incentivizing white hat behavior and looking carefully into projects that maybe haven't been investigated too thoroughly. Like open Log4j a couple of years ago was a great example of a bug that had been there for a long time. The black hats probably knew about it for a long, long time before it got exposure and then finally fixed. And then, of course, there was the XZ issue just recently where someone who was trusted put some a backdoor in, and that happened because the original maintainer just didn't have the time, energy, or financial incentives required to maintain it. So that person handed it to someone else that they thought they could trust. Like T protocol fundamentally, hopefully, makes that system more robust in general. And so, yeah, like people participating outside of open source maintainers themselves, not just developers, but people who just understand intrinsically that open source is worth some percentage of the entire software industry because the entire software industry uses it. That level of participation is like genuinely new. Like there is nothing else like it. We're not begging companies to support their open source. We're encouraging entire swaths of new users to see that they can also benefit by participating in what we built and the value of open source. So, you know, there's parts that are similar, parts that are extensions, and parts which are genuinely new, and we're very excited to see, you know, what happens with that. As well as the fact that, you know, this is a system that is governed by the open source community, and it's not some company that is participating and trying to, you know, steal fees from the open source maintainers. Like you can only really do that with crypto, where like we've had to devise the parts of the tokenomics that funnel the token back into the association that's running the protocol so that it can continue to like siphon those rewards around, but they're not taking a profit, right? It's just like minuscule pieces here and there. There's no fees associated with any of the actual rewards that go to open source maintainers.
Yeah, that leads actually into my last two questions. So the first of those two is, would you have you considered extending T beyond open source and you know to maybe other forms of intellectual property like books or podcasts or just products in general?
Yeah, well, you know, when I was starting this, I had a moment of inspiration at one point about how maybe this could be used with science. Because you know there's reputation data in scientific papers like citations and things. And, like, could that incentivize science to operate a little less like it is now, where you know it kind of works, but you know companies are directing the agenda of science quite heavily. Universities do a lot of good work, but you know science is primarily beneficial to companies with agendas. So yeah, I could see it working for other ecosystems for sure, and like books is an interesting idea. I don't think we're going to do that. I want to concentrate on what we're doing. I want to make sure it works super great and super well, and I don't want to be distracted. But I could see how people can take what we've done once it's proved its validity and that it works, and build equivalent systems for other sectors. And I hope that happens.
Yeah, that's cool. You mentioned that an organization might siphon off a little bit as part of the process. Have you ever considered how that T could actually be another open source project that actually reaps rewards as part of its value contribution to the ecosystem? Is that ever something you thought about?
Yeah, well, certainly. Like, once we've open sourced all our pieces, I am pretty sure that we'll get some people staking against those projects, which will help the T protocol to keep itself the right level of buoyancy that's required. But you know, we have plenty of plans for making sure the tokenomics that we've built is fully functional. However, you know, PackageX is the company that was VC funded that is the core contributor to the T protocol. Like, we built it essentially. We have a bunch of open source, and so we're definitely going to be trying to get people to stake against that and like help sustain this company, so that we can continue to build out more and more open source. Like, I can see it being something that changes the possibilities for commercial open source companies. I think commercial open source can be great, but you can see how most commercial open source companies typically end up, you know, pushing resources towards where they know they can make a revenue model. And that's not how open source works. Open source is about solving a problem very specifically and keeping the scope tight and making sure it solves that properly and well. And capitalism just has this tendency to make things more and more bloated, more and more directed towards revenue. And T protocol doesn't reward that. T protocol rewards being impactful to the entire open source graph. So if you start building out stuff that only benefits yourselves, your T rank will fall, and you'll lose those incentives. So yeah, I think there's some cool stuff that could happen.
I love that. Yeah, that's neat. I'm still trying to understand a little bit about the TE protocol and how donations work, and how does that relate to staking? So how are donations different from like cash donations that people make as a thank you, and how does staking relate to donations, or does it not?
Yeah, they're separate. Now, the donation functionality we're adding, because at the end of the day, there's always going to be people who want to donate, especially companies. Like, we're going to make sure that we handle the tax implications for companies that donate properly, so it's a seamless thing. And of course, donating by the T protocol means that a percentage is always taken off of that donation and spread through the dependency graph for those packages. And since we have the dependency graph for everything, all the way down to glibc, you are funding the entire open source graph as a result. But yeah, like, donations are added because we know people are going to want it, and it was fairly simple for us to add it. But we don't see that as being the major way that we have impact on making open source sustainable. The staking is how we're getting the rest of the crypto community interested. So people who never really knew much about open source before have bought into our vision, as we've told it repeatedly over the last 2 years, about how our open source is enormous value. It's just that nobody has, before T protocol, managed to represent that value in a way that you, as just someone interested in cryptocurrencies and token, can participate in a way where you're putting some token at risk, but that risk comes with a reward, provided that you stake it for a reasonable amount of time. And like, the staking also helps our tokenomics. It involves locking token up, which keeps like the supply more stable. But we're also doing this so that everyone else gets involved, and some of those stake rewards always go to the projects. That's also important because T rank rewards the transitive dependencies far more than the ones at the edge of the graph. Some people consider this a problem. For me, this is more about like fixing the problems where these projects that are in the middle, that we call the Nebraska projects after that famous XKCD comic, typically are completely unknown after just a few years because everyone builds on top of them and then they're just deep in that stack. So making sure they're sustained is really the most important part. If you're on the edge, then stop being on the edge, but also just stick in your README. Hey, stake against our project. We get rewarded, but also you get rewarded. And I hope that will also help companies to stake against projects, because the community will pressure that, is what I'm hoping. Like, now there's this very simple way to effectively donate to projects, but you're not donating, you're also getting rewards yourself. So it seems an easier sell for the corporates, but also projects will be like, hey, well, if you want priority response to your issues or even pull requests, then we want to see you participating in making sure we're a sustainable project.
Yeah, that's really cool. On more than one occasion, I've had people at the company where I work come to me and say, I'd like to consider using this open source project, maybe Cherry Pie in this case, or Chroot, which is the foundational project for that, and saying, can I trust this project? Is this project maintained? Basically asking me to stake it, stake my reputation against this project, or can I stake it? If T existed, then I could, that would be a great way to say, actually, yes, it is, and here's how you as a corporation can say that you're staked against it, that you're invested in it. So it seems like there are a number of roles in these in the T system. There's the maintainers. There's these people who are staking. Do you call them stakers or investors? And then there's also donors. But what are the roles and how do they relate?
Yeah, so the most important role is obviously the open source maintainers. We have 15,000 projects onboarded during our testnet so far. This open source maintainers are who we built this for. They're the most important users by far, and they should participate any way they want, but all they need to do is participate by registering and then receiving those rewards. Then we have, other developers for sure are involved, but they will just stake most likely, or report bounties, or possibly use our system for donating. Another benefit of donating is you get an NFT, which some people love that kind of thing, right? But it is proof of donation. Companies could use that to like show off like all the projects they've donated to in a purely completely verifiable manner. Like anyone can go on chain and check that data. You don't have to query us at all. You just have to go onto the blockchain and check out those transactions. So yeah, donators are going to be a part of it, but stakers, vulnerability reporters, there's a lot of participants, and like over the next 4 to 5 years, we'll be building out more and more systems for those who recognize the value of open source to participate in that in ways that benefit them directly, indirectly, or just benefit the entire ecosystem in a tangible, verifiable manner.
Yeah, I saw those NFTs for donations. I definitely want to get the mug with the Python on it. So I'm going to go after that pretty soon here. Because this is tokenomics, because it's crypto. I imagine lots of people have made a lot of money. A lot of people lost a lot of money in crypto. Do you expect that there are people who will make a lot of money in, make a killing in T, or not? How do you expect that to play out for for certain rare people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's one of the things about crypto, which it gives us an edge in the respect that you can rely on those people who really enjoy the kind of gamble of crypto to like throw a bunch of money that maybe they've already made it with other projects on other Web3 type projects, that is. So yeah, I'm sure there will be some people that see that this token is something that can go somewhere, and they'll benefit from that. I can't really speak to it in great detail because it's problematic, but the people that I want to make a killing with it, the open source maintainers, and by participating in the test net, there will be rewards associated with that, which I hope come mainnet are tangible. Not possible to say, but it's part of the reason we're building this, is to like make it so open source maintainers are given the rewards that they deserve. Otherwise, yeah, that's all. There's potential, That's the truth of it. We're a successful project. Like 1.5 million people on the testnet is very large for these kinds of crypto projects. So yeah, worth being a part of it.
Fantastic. Yeah, I know there's something on the website about risks, but what are the risks of getting involved with T, and who is exposed to those risks?
Yeah, so we were very careful with how we designed it so that there's no risks for open source maintainers. We just want you to keep making it open source. We don't want you to have to worry about other things. So the risks are solely to the other people trying to participate. Like staking has risks associated with it. You're staking some T token, you're locking up that value, and there are mechanisms inside the protocol that might slash that value. The first major one being the vulnerability bounty system that we're building, where if a vulnerability is found in the project, then the people staking against that project will be slashed. Now that there's careful mechanisms to ensure that it's an accurate vulnerability, the open source maintainer themselves has to confirm that. And if they deny it's a vulnerability, then it can be repealed and by the TDAO, which is the governance committee of the T Association, the non-profit that's running it. To because no open source maintainer wants to admit to vulnerabilities they don't think exist, but we need a mechanism to make sure that everyone agrees, the whole community agrees on that. So yeah, there will be several different kinds of slashing event that could happen for staking, and it's necessary to put it at risk, right? You have to choose what projects you're staking against. You have to try and choose ones that are secure and are robust and stable, and the yield that you're getting against projects varies based on like the number of people staking and like how much rank that project has. So we're encouraging people to go out and find projects that have higher yields that they believe in the future of, so that those staking rewards are spread as far and wide as makes sense. But yeah, there's risk associated that they're going to have to take into account.
Excellent. Do we have time for more? I know we're running up on time.
I got some time.
Sure. So the last one that came to mind just a moment ago is does a open source project have to be part of an ecosystem like PyPI or APM to show up in T, or are you able to bring this? You mentioned glibc. Does the CPython project, for example, show up in T? I know that's one that I've contributed to, but isn't part of other systems I've worked with.
Yeah, so everything has to be part of a package manager, but we also indexed Homebrew and Debian's apt in order to bring in like these dependencies that aren't in programming language package managers. Now, longer term, I'd love it if we could add things that aren't in package managers at all, because there is open source like that. But initially, this was the best way for us to produce reliable impact data, seeing as open source maintainers choose their dependencies. And it's reputable. Like this, the entire open source graph wouldn't work if the dependency data was fake or in people trying to scam or phish the system in some manner. So it's necessary currently, otherwise the T ranks wouldn't be accurate, and the dependency graph we use to funnel token wouldn't be accurate. But longer term, we are hoping that we can introduce other mechanisms, and we're hoping the community will suggest those as proposals to the TDAO. Seeing as once we go live with mainnet, we will start requiring the community to okay everything that we build, because this is for the open source community, and if we're building things that don't benefit them, then it's pointless.
Neat. Yeah, that's great. Another dimension, and I can bring this up with the engineers or the product managers, is there are some projects that vendor their dependencies, and so their dependencies aren't going to show up in the graph, and the transitive dependencies aren't going to be relevant. It might be worth, I don't know if you've considered it yet, but introspecting those packages and kind of de-vendoring them from a data model perspective might be useful.
Yeah, well, certainly happy to add things that allow that to happen. I think in general, the vendoring is more at the edges of the graph rather than in the middle where it makes the most impact to the T rank. But happy to add things. It's just up to the community to propose it, and then for us to think out, a solid, reliable way that we can ingest that data. But certainly, I can even think of a few projects where I know they vendor things. If anything, I think this is a sign to the projects that are being vendored that if they want to increase their T rank, maybe they need to build themselves in such a manner. Distribute themselves in such a manner where people aren't encouraged to be vendoring them. Maybe that's the solution, because I think most of the projects I can think of that vendor dependencies is done because the project itself isn't distributed in a way that's convenient, or modifications are required to the vendor package that weren't accepted into the original package by pull request and things like that. So yeah, it's kind of, maybe it's an indication that you're just not being a great open source citizen, and now we're incentivizing you to do so.
Nice. Cool. That's good to know. Yeah, that's all the questions I had for you.
Great. Well, again, Jason, I got one more question that I like to ask everyone before we part. If someone came up to you today and asked you, I'm really passionate about what open source can be. I'm not, sure where to start. What would you recommend to them to do to get involved in open source?
Boy, that's a tricky one. One of the ways I started getting involved was through Stack Overflow, and I've recommended that to others, and people said, "Yeah, I don't know. That's not necessarily a great community, and it can be kind of hostile." So that worked for me, but it doesn't work for everyone. What I do suggest is find a project that you're interested in, find something that's either you're working with or you'd like to work with, and get engaged with that project. Figure out where do they direct contributors. Look for a project first of all that probably is welcoming to contributors. You could try to find a more difficult project, but it's probably easier to start with something that has a contributing guide, and look through the issues there and find maybe some ones that are good first issues, or if there aren't any labeled as good first issue, reach out to the maintainers, reach out to the project and say, I'd like to help. And also think about how you'd like to help. Do you want to improve the readability of the documentation? Do you want to add a new feature? Do you want to improve the user interface? Think about what it is that you'd like to see, and propose that, right? Tell them this is how you'd like to help contribute, and then ask how, what you can do in that end. Almost, in most of these open source projects, you're likely to find good advice. If you don't find good advice, or you find a hostile project, don't take it personally. And there are plenty of projects out there that would be delighted to have more contributors and even co-maintainers. And I certainly, across the suite of projects I maintain, would love to have more people helping. So just keep looking, find something that works, and it'll get natural. After 2 or 3 of these kinds of activities, you'll start to just find you're a member of the community. The other thing is, find a local meetup or a Discord community where you can interact with people and ask these kinds of questions. And more likely than not, you'll find that there are lots of welcoming communities out there to help you get involved.
Awesome. Thank you. I think I speak for everyone too, Jason. Thanks for everything you do and have done for open source. Thanks for testing, for trying to giving us a shot to win you over and everything of that in that nature. Max, any parting words from you?
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. It's always great to chat with other open source maintainers, and yeah, thanks for all the open source you do.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in, Jason and Max. Thank you guys so much for your time. Until next time, we will see you guys soon, and thanks for everything.